The ferry's horn groaned, a sound like a leviathan's sigh as it nudged against the weathered dock. Dean gripped the cold metal railing, the vibrations shuddering through his palms. He hadn't slept well in months, a restless half-slumber punctuated by the phantom echo of a child's laughter that always died on his lips before he could fully grasp it. The constant ache in his chest was a familiar companion now, a dull throb beneath his ribs that nothing seemed to alleviate. Solitude, he'd told himself, was the only balm left. This island, this forgotten speck of rock in the vast, indifferent ocean, was to be his sanctuary. The ramp clanged down, metal protesting against concrete, and a thin line of vehicles began to disembark. Dean's old pickup, packed with the sparse remnants of his former life, felt heavier than usual. He steered it off the ferry, the salty air immediately biting at his exposed skin, carrying with it the sharp tang of brine and something else. Something metallic and damp, like old rust mixed with wet stone. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with unspoken rain, and a dense fog already began to roll in from the west, blurring the edges of the distant cliffs. The road wound along the coastline, narrow and cracked, barely wide enough for one vehicle. The few structures he passed were hunched and dark, their windows like vacant eyes. He saw no other cars, no pedestrians, just the relentless gray expanse of the sea on one side and the scraggly, wind-whipped vegetation on the other. It felt less like an arrival and more like an exit, a passage into a place where the world forgot to look. Eventually, the road opened slightly, revealing a low, squat building ahead. It was a border checkpoint, stark and unwelcoming, despite its apparent disuse. A single flickering fluorescent light cast a sickly yellow glow over the peeling paint of its walls. A heavy-set man, his face weathered into a permanent scowl, emerged from a small booth. He wore a thick, oil-stained jacket and a cap pulled low over his eyes. "Name?" The man grunted, his voice gravelly, his gaze lingering on the cartographic equipment visible through Dean's rear window. There was no warmth in his eyes, only a weary suspicion. "Dean Miller," he replied, the sound of his own name feeling oddly unfamiliar in this desolate place. "I'm here for the Lighthouse cottage. My grandfather, Arthur Miller, left it to me." The man's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something unreadable passing through them. "Arthur, huh? Been a while since anyone mentioned old Arthur." He didn't offer a smile or any sign of recognition beyond that. He just stared, his silence stretching, thick with unspoken thoughts. "You staying long?" "Indefinitely," Dean said, trying to project a confidence he didn't quite feel. The man's scrutiny made his skin prickle. He felt like an interloper, a trespasser. The officer merely nodded, then stepped back, waving a dismissive hand towards the road ahead. "Just you, then. Don't cause any trouble." The implicit threat hung in the damp air. The road grew steeper, winding higher above the churning waves. The fog thickened, pressing in around the pickup, reducing visibility to mere yards. Dean switched on his high beams, the twin cones of light cutting through the opaque white, revealing only the immediate stretch of asphalt. Below it, nestled into the craggy cliff face, was the cottage. It was smaller than he'd imagined, a squat stone structure that looked as if it had grown organically from the rock itself. It was desolate, neglected, its windows like vacant sockets staring out at the turbulent sea. Stepping out, the wind tore at his jacket, whipping his hair across his face. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks far below was a constant guttural roar, a primeval heartbeat. The cottage door, a heavy slab of aged oak, resisted his initial push. He leaned his shoulder into it, and with a groan of protest from rusty hinges, it creaked open. A wave of damp, stale air, thick with the smell of mildew, dust, and something else indefinable, something earthy and old like forgotten graves, washed over him. He fumbled for his phone, its weak beam of light cutting through the gloom. Dust motes danced in the sparse light, swirling like phantom insects. Everything was draped in a thick gray blanket of grime. Furniture, shrouded in yellowed sheets, stood like silent skeletal figures. He walked through the small living room, his footsteps echoing on the bare floorboards. A faded map, a relic of his grandfather's trade, hung crookedly on one wall, its edges curled with age. He ran a hand over a dusty wooden table, leaving a clean streak in the grime. He pulled back the sheet. It was a small, intricately carved wooden box, its surface adorned with strange, swirling patterns that seemed to writhe in the dim light. He moved to the kitchen, then the two small bedrooms. In the main bedroom, a single, unmade bed stood, the sheets discolored and stiff. He imagined his grandfather, a man he barely knew, spending his final days in this desolate place. As he returned to the living room, a faint sound reached him, barely audible above the wind's lament. He froze, straining his ears. The sound didn't repeat. He told himself it was just the house settling, the old timbers groaning in the wind. But a prickle of unease, sharp and insistent, began to spread through him. He was alone, utterly alone, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling of being observed, of something unseen stirring just beyond the periphery of his vision. He would make it work. He had to. The engine of the borrowed utility vehicle grumbled its discontent as Dean navigated the winding gravel path away from the border checkpoint. The officer's parting words, a cold sliver of dismissiveness, still clung to the air, making the hairs on his arms stand on end. He glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the weathered wooden shack and its solitary occupant shrink into the perpetual mist until they vanished entirely. There was no turning back now. This island, this desolate inheritance, was his new reality. The road quickly deteriorated, narrowing to little more than a track overgrown with tenacious salt-sprayed flora. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of brine and damp earth, a primal smell that burrowed deep into his lungs. He could hear the ocean now, a low, ceaseless murmur that promised both solace and an ancient, untamed power. The fog, a constant companion, swirled and parted, offering fleeting glimpses of skeletal trees reaching like grasping fingers towards a sky the color of bruised pewter. Finally, the track opened onto a small, windswept clearing. There it stood, the lighthouse keeper's cottage. Squat, stone-faced, and defiant against the elements, it looked less like a home and more like a sentry, perpetually guarding something unseen. The lighthouse itself, a towering sentinel of white and black stripes, loomed nearby, its lantern dark and silent, a monument to forgotten vigilance. Dean killed the engine. The sudden quiet was profound, broken only by the mournful cry of gulls and the relentless sigh of the waves. The wind, a biting, relentless force, immediately tore at his jacket, whipping stray strands of hair across his face. A palpable sense of isolation settled over him, a cloak woven from the fog and the vast, indifferent ocean. This was it, his new beginning, or perhaps his true ending. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak light that pierced the grimy windows. He tried to focus on practicalities, airing out the space, finding the water pump, checking the generator. Anything to ground himself. By late afternoon, after wrestling a reluctant generator into sputtering life, Dean found himself drawn to the single window in what would be his study, overlooking the churning gray expanse of the sea. He watched the tide, a cartographer by trade, his mind instinctively mapping its rhythm. But something was wrong. The water level seemed unusually high, crashing against the low-lying rocks with a ferocity that felt out of sync with the forecast. The shoreline, usually a jagged mosaic of barnacled stone, was almost entirely submerged. He watched, puzzled, as the water surged further up the shingle, then receded with an unnatural swiftness, only to return moments later with renewed vigor, as if breathing. It was an erratic, almost deliberate pulse, unlike any tide he'd ever observed. He dismissed it as an anomaly, perhaps a localized weather phenomenon he hadn't accounted for. The island was remote, after all, subject to its own unique temperament. As dusk began to bleed into the sky, painting it in bruised purples and deep, unsettling grays, the wind picked up. It howled around the cottage, a mournful, keening sound that seemed to carry more than just the roar of the sea. Dean heard it then, faint at first, like the distant wail of a lost child, then growing, weaving itself into the wind's shriek. Indistinct, breathy murmurs that seemed to curl around the corners of the cottage, pressing against the old panes of glass. It was unsettling, the kind of sound that made the fine hairs on his neck prickle. "Just the wind," he muttered aloud, his voice sounding thin and reedy in the sudden quiet of the room. He walked to the old built-in bookshelves, running a hand over the spines of forgotten tomes, hoping to find something to distract him. His fingers snagged on a small, leather-bound book tucked away behind a stack of navigation charts. It felt heavy, swollen with moisture. Pulling it free, Dean saw it was his grandfather's journal. The leather cover was warped, the pages within stiff and brittle, many of them stained with what looked like seawater. The handwriting, once so familiar, now seemed jagged, hurried, almost frantic. Most entries were mundane observations of weather and supplies, but interspersed between them were increasingly erratic passages. He flipped through, his eyes catching on phrases that made his stomach clench. The pull grows stronger. One entry read, "The ink bleeding slightly." Another, a few pages later, scrawled in a heavier hand, "They sing from the depths." The deep song. Then came the sketches. Crude, but undeniably disturbing. Tentacled shapes writhed across several pages, intertwining with vaguely humanoid figures, their faces stretched in silent screams. The most chilling sketch, however, was of the lighthouse itself, its beam piercing a swirling vortex of dark water, from which grotesque, unidentifiable forms seemed to be emerging. Beneath it, a single stark warning. Do not listen. Do not descend. Dean's breath hitched. He closed the journal abruptly, the damp leather cool against his palm. His grandfather, a man of quiet stoicism, had never spoken of such things. Had the isolation finally broken him? The journal was old, water-damaged. Perhaps the ink had run, distorting the words. He was tired, grieving, and prone to finding meaning where none existed. He told himself this, over and over, clutching the journal. The island was not just remote. It felt aware. Dean's fingers still tingled from the clammy leather of the journal. He had closed it, but the words, frantic and desperate, clawed at the inside of his skull. The pact, the deep, the reckoning. His grandfather, a man who measured his life in the rhythmic sweep of the lighthouse beam and the precise charting of currents, had never indulged in flights of fancy. Yet, here it was, scrawled in a hand that had grown increasingly shaky, detailing a madness Dean couldn't reconcile with the stern, quiet man he remembered. Isolation. The relentless drone of the foghorn, the ceaseless churn of the waves. It could wear a man down, unravel his mind. But the sheer conviction in his grandfather's writing, the meticulous detail, even amidst the chaos, gnawed at him. It wasn't the rambling of a broken man. It was the desperate plea of a man who believed what he saw. A cold certainty began to settle in Dean's gut, heavy and unwelcome. He needed answers, not just theories. The determination, a trait honed by years of meticulous cartography, pushed aside the rising unease. He would investigate. The nearest public archive was not on his small, desolate island, but on the larger, more populated island to the east. It meant a journey, a small ferry ride across waters that now seemed to hold a new, unsettling depth. The journey itself was uneventful, but as the ferry cut through the gray-green expanse, Dean found himself staring at the surface, half expecting some impossible shape to rise, some ancient secret to breach the calm. The archives were housed in an old stone building, a relic of a bygone era, repurposed from what had once been a regional administration office. A stoic woman with spectacles perched on her nose. Dean spent hours hunched over microfiche readers, poring through brittle newspaper clippings and faded maritime logs. He started with general island history, searching for anything unusual, any unexplained phenomena that might correspond with his grandfather's vague illusions. The first few hours yielded little beyond fishing quotas and weather reports. Then, a flicker. An old fisherman's tale, tucked into a local folklore column from the 1930s. He found more. Scant mentions, always veiled, always attributed to old wives' tales, or the madness of the sea. References to ancient rites performed by forgotten islanders. Offerings made to the hunger below the waves. One particularly disturbing entry, a fragment of a diary from a 19th century lighthouse keeper, spoke of the pact, a bargain struck long ago to ensure the island's safety, a fragile peace maintained by the ceaseless vigil. The more Dean read, the more the frantic scribblings in his grandfather's journal began to coalesce into a terrifyingly coherent narrative. His grandfather hadn't been delusional. He had been desperately trying to document a truth too horrific to bear. They were symptoms of something stirring, something ancient and hungry, awakened by a forgotten pact that was perhaps now broken. That night, sleep offered no refuge. Dean's dreams were a suffocating plunge into an alien ocean. He felt the immense pressure of impossible depths, the crushing weight of water against his skin. He saw glimpses of colossal, impossible structures, vast and cyclopean, built of an obsidian material that absorbed all light. He woke with a gasp, the hum still vibrating in his ears, a phantom pressure on his chest. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his bare feet meeting the cold floorboards. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, a subtle, ethereal light caught his attention. It wasn't the moonlight, nor the distant sweep of the lighthouse beam. It was a soft, greenish-blue glow, pulsing gently. He squinted, pushing himself up. The light emanated from the corner of the small reading nook, where a damp patch had always been a minor annoyance. Now, clinging to the peeling wallpaper and creeping onto the edge of the wooden bookshelf, was a patch of strange, gelatinous algae. It glowed with an unnerving internal light, a silent, living thing, thriving in the damp, infiltrating his home. It hadn't been there yesterday. It hadn't been there this morning. It was a direct, undeniable intrusion, a physical manifestation of the impossible, growing quietly, relentlessly, within the very walls of his inherited solitude. The frantic scribblings in his grandfather's journal had ceased to be mere paranoia. They were a map, Dean realized, charting not a landscape, but a descent. The erratic tides, the whispers carried on the wind, they weren't natural phenomena. They were a preamble, a slow, deliberate overture to something vast and ancient stirring beneath the waves. A cold dread, far deeper than the island's perpetual chill, settled in his bones. He traced a crude sketch of a distorted symbol, its lines jagged and uneven, a desperate hand trying to capture an unspeakable form. It was a deep, resonant hum, vibrating not just in the air but in the very floorboards beneath his worn boots. He paused, journal clutched in his hand, listening. The sound was too steady, too perfect to be mechanical. He set the journal down on the scarred pine table, intending to return to its unsettling narrative. But as his hand withdrew, the heavy leather-bound book slid an inch, then two, before settling. Dean stared at it. The table was level. The cottage was old, certainly, prone to shifts. But this was a smooth, deliberate movement, as if an unseen hand had nudged it. He reached out, pushed the journal back to its original spot. It stayed. He watched it for a long minute. the hum growing a fraction louder, a deep, pervasive note that seemed to sink into the marrow of his bones. He paced the small cottage, the hum a constant companion now, a low, hypnotic pulse. He found himself drawn to the small, grimy mirror above the wash basin in the corner. He peered into it, seeking reassurance in his own familiar features. But the face that looked back wasn't quite his. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper, etched with an impossible weariness. His pupils, usually a clear hazel, appeared dilated, almost black, and for a fleeting, horrifying moment, they seemed to reflect a greenish luminescence from deep within the glass itself. He leaned closer, breath fogging the surface, trying to wipe away the distortion, but it wasn't on the glass. It was in the image, in the unsettling way his jawline seemed to ripple, as if seen through disturbed water. He stumbled back, heart hammering against his ribs, the hum now a roar in his head, threatening to shatter his skull. This wasn't just his imagination. This wasn't grief playing tricks. This was real. He remembered a time, years ago, crossing a land border after a particularly harrowing journey. Dean had felt exposed, every secret laid bare, every intention questioned. That same invasive feeling, that sense of being utterly transparent to an unseen judging presence, now permeated the cottage. He was being examined, measured, found wanting. Driven by a desperate need for answers beyond the journal's cryptic warnings, Dean began to search the cottage more thoroughly. His grandfather had been a man of hidden compartments and concealed spaces. Behind a loose stone in the hearth, he found it. A small, lead-lined box. They were misshapen, featureless figures, some with limbs bound by thin strands of dried kelp. It smelled faintly of brine and something else. Something cloying and organic, like decaying fish. He understood then. His grandfather hadn't just been documenting. He had been warding. Perhaps even sacrificing. The hum intensified, vibrating through the very floor. Dean dropped the stone, his fingers tingling with a strange numbness. It wasn't a shadow cast by light, but a deeper absence, a patch of absolute blackness that writhed and coalesced. It flowed, liquid and silent, stretching itself thin, then thickening, taking on a vaguely humanoid outline. It seemed to shimmer, as if composed of churning, inky water. Dean couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. His gaze was fixed on the thing, transfixed by its silent, predatory advance. It oozed forward, impossibly fast, its form indistinct but undeniably present. He felt a profound sense of wrongness, an alien consciousness pressing in on his mind, not with words, but with a torrent of images. Crushing depths, black chasms, the slow, inexorable decay of all things. He stumbled back, knocking over a stack of old charts. The noise seemed to startle the form, or perhaps it merely recoiled from the sudden movement. It retracted, flowing back into the corner, shrinking, dissipating, until it was just a deeper stain in the already profound gloom. Dean gasped, his lungs burning. It had been there. It had been real, and it had almost touched him. The hypnotic hum, though still present, felt less like a distant drone and more like a direct personal assault. A siren song from the deep, calling him home. The journal lay open, its yellowed pages a testament to a mind slowly unraveling, or perhaps, Dean now understood, a mind desperately attempting to hold a terrible truth together. His fingers, stained with lamp oil and the residue of dried salt, traced the frantic, spidery script. His grandfather hadn't merely observed the island's peculiar shifts. He had actively recorded them, not as a cartographer maps terrain, but as a priest charts the movements of a volatile deity. The pact, a recurring phrase, appeared again and again, underlined with furious slashes. The boundary must hold. The deep song must not be answered. Dean felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He wasn't just reading a diary. He was reading a confession. a manual for a forgotten war. The erratic tides, the whispers that seemed to coil around the lighthouse at night, weren't natural phenomena. They were a preamble, a slow, deliberate overture to something ancient and hungry. He found a series of intricate drawings, not of the coastline, but of geometric symbols, repeating patterns that seemed to pulse with an unholy energy even on the page. Alongside them, meticulous notes detailed specific times, phases of the moon, and the precise placement of certain stones around the island's periphery. The realization hit Dean with the force of a breaking wave. His grandfather had been sacrificing his sanity, his very life, to maintain a barrier. A low thrum began to vibrate through the floorboards, a subtle resonance that hummed deep within his bones. It wasn't the wind, nor the churning of the sea. It was a sound without origin, a profound, almost musical pressure building in his eardrums, as if the very air was thickening around him. The deep song, he thought, remembering the journal's earlier entries, a shiver tracing its way down his spine. It started as a distant echo, like a monstrous siren call from fathoms below. But now it was closer, insistent, weaving itself into the fabric of his thoughts. He closed his eyes, pressing his palms against his temples, trying to dispel the growing pressure. When he opened them, the lamp on the table flickered with an impossible intensity, casting his own reflection back at him, momentarily distorted, almost alien. Was it the lamp or his perception? The line between reality and hallucination, once firm, was now a shimmering, translucent veil. He needed air, clarity. But the cottage felt suffocating, and the siren song was pulling him, not out, but down. A sudden, undeniable urge seized him, a certainty that the answers lay not in the journal alone, but in the lighthouse itself, the very structure his grandfather had so fiercely protected. He could feel its tendrils reaching, probing. This was it, he realized with a jolt. This was the border checkpoint mentioned in some of the oldest entries, a forgotten demarcation line, a physical manifestation of the boundary his grandfather had fought to maintain. It wasn't just a path to the light, it was a threshold. He passed through it now, the air growing heavier, the sense of ancient watchfulness intensifying. Inside the lighthouse, the spiral stairs seemed endless, each step echoing the deep thrumming in his skull. He reached the base of the lantern room, but his attention was drawn lower to the rough-hewn stone floor. The journal had mentioned the heart of the pact, a place beneath the light. A loose slab, he remembered, a specific marking. His fingers found an indentation, then another. With a grunt, he heaved, and a section of the floor, surprisingly light, shifted upwards, revealing a gaping black maw beneath. This wasn't a natural cave. It was a crypt, a vault, a prison. The chamber was bare, save for a raised stone plinth in the center, worn smooth by countless years. Etched into its surface were the same complex pulsing symbols he'd seen in the journal, glowing faintly in the lantern light as if imbued with a residual energy. Around the base of the plinth, scattered amidst centuries of dust, were fragments of what looked like dried kelp, petrified fish bones, and small, crudely carved wooden effigies, long since bleached and brittle. This wasn't just a place of observation. The deep song pulsed, a relentless rhythm, a heartbeat from the depths. It wasn't just a sound now. It was a physical sensation, a current running through his veins, urging him, inviting him. Dean felt his own mind fraying at the edges, the familiar world dissolving into a shimmering, distorted tapestry. He was standing in the heart of the pact, and the barrier his grandfather had so painstakingly maintained was weakening. Perhaps because Dean was there. Perhaps because the entity beneath the waves had finally found its way in. He was no longer just an observer. He was part of it now. And the pull was overwhelming. The journal lay splayed open on the table, its weathered pages a testament to forgotten horrors. Dean didn't need to read another word. It wasn't the sea's call, nor the wind's lament. This was something ancient, something else, drawing him deeper into the cottage's foundations. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that the answers weren't just in ink and paper, but beneath his very feet. He found it in the cellar, not hidden behind a clever mechanism, but simply overlooked. A section of the rough-hewn stone floor, slightly darker, subtly offset, that had always felt colder than the rest. He knelt, his fingers tracing the faint seam. With a grunt, he wedged his fingers into the crack, pulling. The stone slab groaned, grudgingly yielding. It wasn't heavy, just stubborn, as if it had been waiting, resisting discovery for centuries. A narrow, lightless shaft descended into the earth, exhaling a breath that tasted of ozone and primordial muck. This was it. He switched on his headlamp, its beam swallowed by the absolute blackness. The shaft was rough, hand-carved, descending steeply. He could hear the drip of water, distorted, echoing, as if falling into an impossibly deep well. The descent felt endless, a journey not just into the earth, but into a different dimension of reality. Then, the tunnel widened, abruptly opening into a vast subterranean cavern. The air here was almost liquid, pressing in on him, making his lungs ache with each breath. The metallic, briny scent was overpowering, mingled now with something acrid, like burnt minerals. And then he saw it. It wasn't built, not truly. It pulsed. Not with light, but with a deep, internal rhythm. A slow, viscous throb that mirrored the hum in his bones. The surface of the spire was smooth, yet somehow porous, like solidified ichor, and within its depths, faint, shifting patterns of light, not quite blue, not quite green, writhed like trapped things. This was the border checkpoint. He knew it instinctively. The threshold between what was known and what was utterly alien. Stepping into this chamber felt like crossing into a domain where the rules of the world above no longer applied. He felt himself drawn forward, an invisible current pulling him towards the pulsating monolith. As he drew closer, the images began. They weren't visions in the typical sense, not projected onto the air, but implanted directly into his mind, raw and unbidden. He saw the island, not as he knew it, but submerged. The cottage, a shattered ruin, dissolving into the crushing black. But it wasn't just water. It was a fluid, thick and viscous, teeming with forms that writhed and pulsed, eyeless things with barbed tentacles and mouths that gaped with impossible hunger. And beneath it all, vast beyond comprehension, was it. The entity. It wasn't just in the deep. It was the deep. Its consciousness was a tide, washing over the island, seeping into the very rock, twisting life into grotesque parodies of itself. Then the focus shifted, sharpened, centered on him. He was standing on the shore, but the shore was made of glistening black ooze, and the waves were not water, but the same viscous, coiling substance. He was a vessel, a conduit, his mind a window through which the entity peered, its ancient hunger now directed, focused, personal. The vision intensified, becoming a sickening symphony of sounds. The slurping of unseen mouths, the grinding of tectonic plates, the mournful, echoing cries of things that had never known light. He gasped, a dry, rattling sound in the heavy air, and stumbled backward, away from the pulsating spire, away from the overwhelming, annihilating presence. The entity wasn't just stirring. It was awake, aware, and actively reaching for him. And it intended to take everything. The hum that had merely vibrated in his bones now throbbed, a relentless drumbeat against the inside of his skull. Dean felt it less as a sound and more as a pressure. A vast, unseen weight pressing in from all sides, threatening to collapse the very air around him. The journal lay open, its archaic script blurring and reforming before his eyes. He squeezed them shut, but the shifting forms persisted behind his eyelids, dark, indistinct shapes writhing in a watery abyss. He wasn't just reading about the terror anymore. He was living it. The entity wasn't just stirring. It was actively reaching. A tremor ran through the floorboards, a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to emanate from beneath the very foundation of the island. The glass in the lantern rattled, a thin, frantic clatter. Dean instinctively gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't just observing. It was probing, testing the limits of his mind, searching for a weakness, a fissure through which to pour its terrible essence. He knew, with a horrifying certainty that solidified in his gut, what this meant. It wasn't just the island it wanted to claim. It was him. His mind, his consciousness, his very being. It was trying to break through, to possess him, to use him as a vessel, a gateway. He was a fragile barrier, a mere border checkpoint between its world and his, and that barrier was weakening. He felt it fraying, stretching thin, threatening to snap. He couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't. His gaze snapped back to the journal, his eyes scanning the faded script with a renewed, desperate urgency. His fingers, trembling, traced the lines of text, searching for any scrap of information, any hint of a defense. They were different from the rest, surrounded by fragmented sentences and frantic scribbles in the grandfather's hand, almost illegible. He forced himself to focus, to pull the words from the page, one by agonizing word. Seal, the breach, return, slumber, not through force, but through offering. The word hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Dean's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He read on, deciphering the broken phrases, piecing together the terrifying puzzle. The ritual wasn't about destroying the entity, but the price. The price was steep. A life. Not taken, but given. A memory of profound love. Severed from the heart. A piece of oneself. To mend the tear. Dean's breath hitched. A life. A memory of profound love. Was that what it meant? Was he to sacrifice the very essence of his grief, the last tangible link to what he had lost? It wasn't just about his life, but about his innermost self, the very fabric of his identity. The journal described a final, desperate act, a ritual to be performed at the very edge of the island, at the precise point where the entity's influence was strongest. It spoke of a conduit, a vessel, and a deliberate, conscious relinquishing. But the instructions were maddeningly incomplete. The final few lines were smeared, indecipherable, as if his grandfather had been interrupted, or had simply lacked the will to finish. He stared at the illegible scrawl, a knot of despair tightening in his chest. He had found a way, a desperate, terrible path, but the map was torn. He needed more. Was it a physical sacrifice? A mental one? The implications were staggering, terrifying. He could feel the entity pushing, testing, its unseen tendrils brushing against the outermost reaches of his mind. He was running out of time. The border checkpoint was about to be breached. The journal, his grandfather's last desperate legacy, held the answers. If only he could wrest them from its cryptic pages before the entity claimed him entirely. The revelation from the journal had cleaved Dean's world in two, leaving him suspended over an abyss of impossible choice. He thought of the quiet ache that had become his constant companion, the phantom weight of a hand in his, the scent of lavender and salt that still sometimes clung to his clothes. Was that the price? The thought was a chilling certainty, a new layer of horror. He had sought solitude, a balm for his grief, and instead found a crucible demanding its ultimate sacrifice. Outside the cottage, the island itself was screaming, not with sound, but with a visceral, churning chaos that vibrated through the very stones of the lighthouse. The wind, no longer merely strong, now possessed a predatory howl, tearing at the ancient structure, rattling the thick glass of the lantern room. Rain lashed horizontally, needles of ice stinging the few exposed patches of rock, but it wasn't just rain. Within the downpour, Dean saw fleeting, indistinct shapes, like gelatinous membranes stretching and contracting against the gray canvas of the sky. The familiar scent of old wood and brine was being steadily overwritten by that sickly, briny stench, a smell that scraped at the back of his throat and seemed to seep into his bones. The transformations were no longer subtle. The seaweed clinging to the rocks outside had grown unnaturally thick, writhing with an independent, almost conscious life, its fronds coiling and uncoiling like black serpents. The island was becoming a reflection of the thing that stirred beneath it, a grotesque, living extension of its will. Dean's gaze swept across the open pages of his grandfather's journal, the ink bleeding slightly in the humid air. The final entries were stark, almost desperate, detailing the counter-ritual, a convergence of specific elements, a precise alignment, and the ultimate offering. The journal didn't just explain what to do, but why. The entity, it explained, was not merely ancient. It was primordial, a force that predated human consciousness, yet it had found a way to tether itself to the world through the deepest wells of human emotion: grief, despair, profound loss. It wasn't about appeasement. It was about disentanglement. It was the only way to break the pact, to push back the encroaching reality. A grim resolve hardened in Dean's chest, chasing away the last vestiges of fear. This wasn't about him anymore, not truly. It was about the island, about the fragile membrane between worlds. His hands moved with a newfound purpose, gathering the items detailed in the journal. A small, tarnished silver bell, its chime muted by time and salt. A handful of dried sea lavender, its faint, sweet fragrance a fragile defiance against the encroaching stench. And the most difficult, the personal offering. A small, smooth stone he had carried in his pocket since the day of the funeral, a physical anchor to his grief. He made his way to the small, circular antechamber beneath the lighthouse's lantern room, the designated space. The air here was even heavier, charged with an almost palpable hum. The single window, usually offering a panoramic view of the churning sea, now showed only a swirling gray-black maelstrom, the distinction between sky and water utterly lost. As he laid out the items on the worn wooden floor, a new, unsettling feature caught his eye. Just beyond the threshold of the antechamber, where the winding stairs began their descent, a shimmering, translucent barrier had materialized. It wasn't opaque, but it distorted the light, rippling like heat haze on a summer road. And within its shimmering surface, faint, geometric patterns pulsed, shifting with an impossible logic. He stared at it, a knot tightening in his stomach. It hadn't been there moments ago. It was a border checkpoint, a threshold marking the final entry into a different kind of reality, erected by the entity itself. He ran a hand over the shimmering surface. It was cool, like glass, but yielded slightly, as if he were touching thick jelly. This was it, then, the point of no return. The entity was tightening its grip, marking its territory, forcing him to acknowledge the absolute finality of his choice. He swallowed, the taste of salt and fear sharp on his tongue. The wind outside roared, a sustained, triumphant bellow. Dean took a deep, shuddering breath, clutching the small stone in his hand. He was ready. The wind howled a dirge, a sound Dean now recognized as the island's lament. Rain lashed the granite, each drop a tiny hammer blow against the ancient stone of the lighthouse. He pushed against the heavy iron door, its hinges groaning like an old man's knees. The air inside was thick, cold, tasting of salt and something metallic, something wrong. Above him, the beam of the lamp swept through the gloom, a futile gesture against the encroaching darkness. He gripped the worn leather journal, its pages now brittle with salt and age, a lifeline in his trembling hand. The ritual, his grandfather's desperate legacy, was etched into his mind. It was not a physical thing, not entirely. As he ascended the spiral staircase, each step was a battle. No. He clenched his jaw, forcing the memory back, knowing it was a lure, a cruel, exquisite bait. The entity craved his grief, his loss, the raw wound that had festered in his soul. It fed on the echoes of what was, twisting them into weapons. The ascent grew steeper, the air heavier. Finally, he reached the landing just below the lamp room, a circular chamber that served as a critical threshold. This was it. The place his grandfather's notes had marked with a crude, trembling X. This was the border checkpoint. Here, the veil between worlds was thinnest, torn by the ancient pact, made porous by generations of neglect and the island's isolation. The floor here was slick with a thin, oily sheen of seawater, even though no window was broken, no crack visible. Dean knelt, fumbling in his satchel for the implements his grandfather had meticulously described. A small, smooth stone, bleached white by the sea. A shard of obsidian, sharp as a razor. And a vial of his own blood, drawn hours ago, still warm against his skin. The entity's presence here was overwhelming, a tangible force. It felt like standing at the edge of a bottomless pit, the air vibrating with its immense, silent roar. He spread the journal open on the wet stone, its pages curling. The ink seemed to swim, the words shifting, mocking him. Come back. He could almost feel the weight of her hand, the warmth of her skin. This was the deepest cut, the entity's cruelest thrust. This is not her. He repeated the mantra, a thin shield against the onslaught. This is not real. He placed the white stone in the center of the oily pool. His hands shook as he uncorked the vial, letting 3 drops of his blood fall onto the stone. The blood didn't mix with the oily water. Instead, it pulsed, a tiny crimson heartbeat, before being absorbed by the stone, which now glowed with a faint inner light. Then, the obsidian. The ritual called for a severing, a sacrifice. Not of life, but of connection. The journal had hinted at it, but the full horror now manifested. The pact didn't just bind the entity, it offered it sustenance. It fed on the deepest human sorrow, drawing strength from grief, from love lost and remembered. He looked at the obsidian shard, its edge glinting. His grandfather's cryptic notes. The price of closure is forgetting. He had dismissed it as metaphor, but now, faced with the entity's full, terrible presence, he understood. How could he? How could he willingly erase her? The entity roared, not with sound, but with a wave of despair that threatened to crush him. Visions of her face, laughing, crying, sleeping, flashed before his eyes, vivid, heartbreakingly real. The memory of her warmth, the comfort of her presence, the very essence of their shared life, was being offered as tribute, as the final agonizing component of the ritual. With a choked sob, he raised the obsidian shard. He plunged the shard not into his flesh, but into the glowing stone, into the heart of the border checkpoint, picturing the memories of her, all of them, flowing into the stone, sealing them away, severing the link. A searing pain, not physical, but soul-deep, ripped through him. The phantom touch vanished. The scent of lavender evaporated, replaced by the acrid smell of ozone. The pressure in his chest eased, then vanished entirely. The lighthouse groaned, a different sound now, a sound of settling, of equilibrium. The oily water on the floor receded, absorbed into the stone. The white stone, now dull and lifeless, shattered into dust. Dean collapsed, gasping, the obsidian shard falling from his numb fingers. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling an emptiness that was more profound than any grief he had ever known. He had stopped the entity. He had sealed the pact. But he had paid the price. Her face, her name, the sound of her voice. They were gone. A blank space where the most vibrant part of his life had been. He was free of the entity's torment, but also free of his most cherished memories. He was an empty vessel, a cartographer who had mapped out his own oblivion. The glow from the stone intensified, not a comforting warmth, but a cold, sickly luminescence that pulsed in time with a new, thrumming beat in Dean's own chest. It wasn't his heart. The blood he'd offered had not merely been absorbed, it had been woven into the very fabric of the white stone. Now a living alien thing. The oily pool didn't recede. Instead, it shimmered, reflecting the stone's eerie light, and then, slowly, the oppressive weight that had pressed down on him for weeks began to lift. It wasn't a sudden release, but a gradual, agonizing decompression, leaving an echo of its presence, like a phantom limb. He stumbled back from the makeshift altar, his legs weak, his vision blurring at the edges. The air in the cavern, once thick with the scent of brine and decay, now tasted thin and metallic, like old coins. He was exhausted, yes, but it was a deeper exhaustion than mere physical fatigue. He looked at the stone, still humming faintly in the pool. The deep song was not gone. It was merely contained, or perhaps transferred. Had he truly neutralized it? Or had he merely become its new vessel, its reluctant guardian? It was over. But the cost, he didn't yet fully grasp it. It still pulsed with a faint inner light, a dim internal sun. The ascent from the subterranean chamber was a blur of aching muscles and a mind that felt like static. When he finally emerged into the gray light of dawn, the island seemed muted. Its vibrant greens and browns leached of their color. The fog, usually a persistent presence, had thinned to wisps, revealing the harsh, craggy coastline. The air tasted clean, but it felt wrong. Too quiet. Too empty. He didn't return to the cottage. He walked straight to the dock, his boat bobbing gently in the water. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The journey across the choppy waters of the Sound was uneventful, a stark contrast to his arrival. The gulls cried overhead, their calls sharp and clear, devoid of the sinister undertones he'd grown accustomed to hearing. The sea was still, its surface a bruised purple reflecting the bruised sky. Dean stared at the horizon, at the distant line of the mainland, his mind a quiet, echoing cavern. He felt detached, observing his own actions from a distance. The man who had set out for the island, seeking solitude and peace, was gone. Days blurred into a monotonous procession of movement. He avoided cities, drawn instead to the desolate, forgotten roads that wound through sparse landscapes. He was heading north, towards a place he didn't know, driven by an instinct he couldn't name. He reached the border checkpoint late one afternoon. A tall, uniformed officer, his face impassive, approached Dean's car. "License and passport, please," the officer said, his voice clipped and neutral. Dean fumbled for his documents. His hands felt clumsy, alien. He noticed the officer's eyes linger on his face for a beat too long. Dean opened his mouth, but no words came. He felt a subtle shift in his perception, a clarity that was both terrifying and absolute. The officer's uniform, the car, the distant mountains, they all seemed to shimmer, their solid forms merely temporary arrangements of something more fundamental, something that pulsed with the same silent energy as the stone in his trunk. He was connected. He was aware. The officer studied him for another long moment, his brow furrowed slightly. "You look tired, sir?" Dean offered a weak, unconvincing smile. "Long drive." The officer nodded slowly, then handed back his documents. "Welcome to the country." He hadn't escaped the deep song. He hadn't merely neutralized it. He had internalized it. The entity wasn't stirring beneath the waves anymore. It was stirring within him. He was no longer just Dean, the cartographer. He was something else, something tied to the ancient, unfathomable depths, a living echo of the island's terrible secret. His sanity wasn't shattered, it was merely reconfigured, and the future, stretching out before him like an endless, desolate highway, was no longer his own. He was free, yes, but forever bound. The deep song had found its new keeper, and Dean knew, with a certainty that froze his very soul, that there would be no fresh start. Only a slow, unending descent into a truth too vast for any single mind to bear.